What's with the lineage in the Bible? That's what we're going to talk about today in Matthew 1. Hi, everyone. This is Jill from the North Woods. I'm so glad you're here. Together, we're going to learn about the Bible one chapter at a time. Matthew 1 starts off with what I call the begats. I guess eye-rolly about the begats because you're starting off, you're going to do a brand new, maybe New Year's resolution. We're going to read the Bible. We're going to learn everything about it. And then the very first thing you hit are this person begat that person. And by the way, begat is a word from the King James Version. But it was basically a lineage of people. And I'm like, oh, why are we doing this? This is so boring. And what does this have to do with anything? I don't understand it. And so either you would skim over it or maybe you would just stop your brand new resolution right there. But it turns out it's very important. And it is very important to a Jewish audience that Matthew was talking to. His name was Matthew, but his real name was Levi, which means that he was probably a Levite. That means his parents were educated, maybe in the priestly class. He was as well. And he was educated. He understood Judaism. Matthew is written to a Jewish audience. And you can tell because it is hinting back towards prophecy. It's like a highlight reel of why Jesus is not a new turn. God had this plan and then he turned left instead of right. And now we have this new thing, which is Jesus. That's not how it goes. What he's trying to point out is there were all these prophecies going all the way along the whole time. And Jesus is the fulfillment of those prophecies. And Jewish people were expecting these prophecies to come true. You also notice, too, that Matthew doesn't explain the prophecies. He lists them, he indicates them, he shows how this prophecy happened and now it's fulfilled, but he knew he didn't have to do that with his audience. He didn't have to go into a deep dive of what prophecy meant. He's trying to point out that Jesus is the same plan that God had from the very beginning, the same plan that we had all the way through Abraham and Isaac and Moses, through King David, through all of the history that was being explained. He thinks this is the fulfillment of everything that was expected. So a lot of this idea that it was written by Matthew comes from church history. The original church had apostles that were alive, so they would have known at least a little bit. There's no reason to think it wasn't accurate. But Matthew also explains a lot about money, taxes, something he would have known a lot about because he was a tax collector, and it was something of interest to him. There's no signature at the very end. He never identifies himself in the story. It would have had to been someone like the Apostle Matthew if it wasn't the Apostle Matthew, someone who was there, a live witness to all of this, who saw everything that Jesus did and had this experience about what went on and what happened. I think when all of us do some kind of talking, we do a YouTube channel, we have a podcast, I have 4 podcasts, you think in your head, who is my audience? And who he is talking to is that Jewish believer who is expecting maybe someone entirely different. Maybe this could have been his parents or his relatives, something like that. That was maybe the audience he had in mind, but he's speaking to these people. He became a tax collector, and we know that because Jesus called Matthew from his tax collecting booth. But tax collectors were not liked. They're still not liked that much either. And not only do people not think very highly of paying taxes, but you have to think in this particular case, it was even worse than that. The tax collectors themselves were notorious people. If you, let's say, owed 2 coins to the government or for the temple tax, maybe you're a little late. The tax collector would say, well, if you throw in an extra coin, I'll overlook you being a little bit late. They had a terrible reputation of being criminals, of being extortionists, and they weren't the kind of people you wanted to hang out with. As someone who went from a priestly class to this tax collector, people probably thought pretty poorly of Matthew and reacted to him being invited in. Now, Matthew was educated. He wrote in Greek, but he probably knew how to read Hebrew for religious practices, to go to the temple. He probably spoke Aramaic like most people at that time. This was a common way that people went with languages. The Greeks sacked Israel in about 330 BC. Alexander the Great went farther and farther east. And then when Rome ate the Greek Empire by decimating it, it took over that. But Greek was a common language, and it was something that everyone would know how to speak. The interesting thing is in the show The Chosen, they decided to make Matthew on the spectrum. He's someone who can't relate very easily with other people, but very smart and took detailed notes and understood what was happening and what he was seeing. So he understood essentially what was going on during this life of Jesus. We'll find out more about Matthew as we get longer in the Gospels. We know that, like I said, Jesus called him to follow. He says, "Follow me," and Matthew did. And the reason it got written down is a lot of them thought that the end of the world, the destruction of everything was coming in their lifetime. They were men in their 20s when Jesus died, around 30. And we think the Gospels were written somewhere in the 50s. That means that these men were also going to be now coming up into their 40s, coming up into their 50s, depending on when it was written. And they're getting to be older men. People just didn't live that long back then. And so then they started realizing if we don't write this down, these first-person accounts will disappear. They probably got a little bit panicked about it. So the stories then started getting written down. Up to this point, they were able to travel around, tell these stories person to person, church to church, and preach the gospel in person. But now we got to get these written down. There's a little bit of urgency in it. And we know that it's long before 70 AD when the Romans sacked Jerusalem, burned it to the ground, took down the temple, took everyone that survived into slavery, and it was terrible. It was a terrible event that happened. So we know that it didn't happen at 70 AD when these were written down, or they would have mentioned this. John was the last apostle to die somewhere around 90 AD after he was exiled on the island of Patmos for a really long time. And then he was released and then wrote down the Gospel of John. So the church legacy, going church to church, followed throughout history. I had a priest tell me about how they have a church father going all the way up to the time of John, and people were related to Timothy according to church records. That's not gospel. It's church tradition and it's church history, but there's probably not a lot of reason to think that it was entirely wrong, that people all the way up to the point of the apostles handing over the church to other people, tradition would have accurately written some of these details down. So it probably is very true. But let's get back to Matthew 1. The entire lineage explains how we got to here, how we got to Jesus. We went through the Old Testament. We had Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And when you grow up Jewish, those three patriarchs of the faith are mentioned all the time. You would often say, our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They're important names in the Jewish faith. And when it comes to Abraham, he was called out of his home and told that he would be given a land and he would be a great nation. He was particularly old at this time, and his wife, more importantly, was also old, too old to have children. But eventually they had Isaac, and the suggestion was that Isaac was going to be sacrificed to God. But at the very last minute, God calls it off, hinting that he is going to do the very thing he can't bring Abraham to do. But God keeps his promises. Jacob was another person who was promised many things by God. He had a problem because he wanted to see things and do things his own way. But God fulfilled those promises as well. Then we go all the way up to David and Solomon that made Israel into the nation of the Bible. David was a great king, but a horrible parent and did many terrible things, but God loved him anyway. Solomon, same thing. Great king, did terrible things. So this lineage becomes important because there were many people in this lineage. And the fact that we're going to see this lineage is going to end in Joseph. And it doesn't say that Joseph is the father of Jesus. It says it's the husband of Mary. Now, The reason we go through the fathers to sons in this particular case is because in the Jewish faith, businesses, property, estates, occupations went through their sons. So with Joseph being a craftsman or a carpenter, Jesus would have been a craftsman and a carpenter and have inherited everything that his father had, all the property, everything. That's how the lineage goes. We're going to learn more about Mary's lineage in the story of Luke, but that's a different time that we're going to talk about that. Now, it was obvious that people knew the line of the Messiah was going to go through David. The prophecies all said that. The root of Jesse is going to be where the Messiah is coming from. But now when we look back at history, the whole story kind of comes together. David's in that line, of course. But the interesting thing is Matthew doesn't explain any of this, like I said. Why these people were part of it, why this was important. And it ends up being boring to us because we don't understand it. But we're going to find out about each of them when we go through the Old Testament. Everyone in this line, we will find out more about. The Romans or the Greeks or Gentiles of any kind would not have been interested in this lineage at all. But a Jewish person would have understood, oh, we are talking about prophecies of the Messiah here. Everybody in this lineage, they had hardships, they had triumphs, they were disappointments. Some of them were disappointing. Some of them were good people and some of them were bad people. Some of them were rich and kingly and some of them were lowly and nobodies. There's even a few prostitutes in there, some people who have done some pretty horrible things, including David. There were some people in there who weren't even Jewish. Naomi came from the tribe of Moabites, which was a whole other tribe of people. That's an indication that the story of Jesus and his lineage is including all of us, whether we're Jewish or Gentile, and that he came here to save all people and not just Jewish people. It's not a story about rich people. It's not a story about poor people. It's a story about everybody. And that's what makes the gospel so important. That's what makes this lineage so important. If you had a king, maybe even like a Caesar or a king from Babylon, and they were going to tell their lineage, they would pick everyone famous. A Roman would have picked, oh, I was from Romulus and Remus, and they would have picked famous people to put in their list. In this particular case, that's not what Jesus is telling in his story at all. He is putting everyone in the story because we're all part of the story in Jesus. Most people in there had no idea they were going to be part of the story of the Messiah. Rahab, the prostitute who let Joshua into Jericho to sack it, they had no idea that they were going to be part of the story of the Messiah. The interesting thing here is that the Bible breaks these generations up into 3 parts of 14. 7 in Judaism means complete, and 14 means very, very complete. What we have are 3 sets of 14 generations. Not every person, not every step along the way, but where he tells this story, 14 is going to be complete. The first 14 is from the beginning of time to David. Then the next is from David to the Babylonian exile. And then the next is from the Babylonian exile to this point. Then the last 7 generations is going to be Joseph and his lineage. That brings us to 49. 50 is also a very magical number when it comes to Judaism. There was something called the Jubilee, and the Jubilee was the 50th year. And that means that in that time, if you owed debt, if you were an indentured servant, and so what an indentured servant means, and it's often said as slave in the Bible, but they weren't slaves. They were people who had a debt and they were going to work off their debts. People did this in the time of coming to America too. I want to come to America. I don't have enough money to get on the boat. I will work for you for 7 years and then work my debt off to you, and then I can go on my way. This is not slavery that we're talking about in the Bible in most cases. We see in this particular case, servitude was forgiven, debts were forgiven in the 50th year. And with Jesus being the 50th in that entire line, it's an indication that he is going to forgive our debts, that everything that we owe God, everything that we have done against God is going to be relieved in this ultimate Jubilee. Most of the story takes place in the northern third of the land of Israel. On the west coast, we have the Mediterranean Sea, Haifa. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful shoreline. Everything along the Mediterranean is gorgeous. And Mary was believed to be from Nazareth. Joseph, we think, came from Bethlehem. And the reason we think that is because when he went home for the census, again, going through the father, he went to Bethlehem for the census. And that was probably his tribal home. We also know that the Messiah is supposed to come out of this particular tribe, from this particular piece of land, and so we are fulfilling more prophecy. They were betrothed to be married, which at that time, it was more than just engagement. They were bound to each other. Them separating would have been like a divorce, which was not allowed. They had to go through a number of steps, including a dowry and many other things, before they could be married, almost a year later. So they were betrothed. They did have that binding relationship together. They weren't allowed to sleep together, and they probably weren't even allowed to be in the same room together without a chaperone. And then after this, after almost a year, they would have fulfilled everything. There would be a great wedding ceremony, and they would be married. And then they would be allowed then to share a bed together, share a home together, and they would have been married in everybody's sight. This commitment was very serious. Joseph finds out that she is with child, and he decides that he is going to set the marriage aside. He's not going to marry her, but he doesn't want to bring it out publicly. She would maybe be stoned to death. She would have been thrown out of her family or thrown out of the village. But it says that Joseph was a good man. The word in Hebrew is tzaddik, which could have meant that he was a holy man. It could have meant that he was a rabbi. It could have meant that he was someone who people in town went to go see because he was so wise, someone upstanding in the community. He didn't want to do this to her. We find out Mary's experience in other Gospels. But then the angel of the Lord came to Joseph in a dream, called him the son of David, because he does have that lineage, and says that he should take Mary as his wife. The baby she carries is from the Holy Spirit, and she will bear a son, and he will be called Jesus. Now, Jesus is the same root as we get Joshua, Yeshua. It's the same name, means he will save. He'll save his people. Another fulfillment of prophecy. We don't live in a world where we look to prophecy very often. We have prophecies in the Christian faith. There were prophecies in the Jewish faith, but a lot of times people don't take them seriously or don't sit around waiting for them to happen. We think at sometimes that God stopped hearing us, that he no longer listens to us, that these things are no longer going to happen. Or if they're going to happen, they're going to happen some other time or in some other way. And I can assure you they are going to happen. Even my grandmother's generation thought that they expected the Messiah to come. So you'd think that there was 400 years from the last prophet in the Old Testament to John the Baptist of silence. They didn't hear anything, but they still expected this prophecy to happen. There were still people there, and we'll meet some of them, who expected this prophecy to happen. My grandmother's generation are waiting 2,400 years for this prophecy to happen because they think Jesus didn't come. But what they will do is they will set a plate out for Elijah at Passover Seders, Passover meals, and hope that Elijah will join them in this meal and finally tell them when the Messiah is going to come. It's something that we don't do a very good job of expecting when God will do something that he promised that he will do. Sometimes people thought that the Messiah was going to be a bit different, that they had a little fuzzy idea about what the Messiah was going to be. But even if they disagreed about what the Messiah was going to be, they still expected him to come. They still expected to come and save the people. Joseph would have understood this. Mary understood this. And he stood by because he is a holy man. Mary was a good woman. They understood when the angels of the Lord told them what was happening, what was really going on. They got that. So this prophecy, too, when the angel is talking to Joseph, goes back to Isaiah 7:14, where it says a virgin is going to bear a son. He will be called Emmanuel, God with us. Anytime that you see El in some word or some name in Hebrew, it means God. That is God's name. El Shaddai. It always means that. And so they would have understood that the virgin giving birth means that God is going to be with us. And Jesus was with us and here on earth. And a lot of people, like I said, were kind of fuzzy about what the Messiah was going to be. Some people expected that the Messiah was going to bring back the time where Israel was the country it was under David. It was about a political kingdom establishment. Other people felt that the Messiah was going to bring back a religious revival, bringing it back to the time of the Bible. A lot of people, through the Roman invasion, through the Greek invasion, weren't really keeping the word of God anymore. You had the Sadducees who didn't believe in the prophets at all. You had many of the people who were making deals with the Romans and the Greeks to avoid getting completely mushed by them in battle, but they had backed away from their faith and no longer believed in it. And so people were hoping that the Messiah was going to come, kick out these rotten Romans or kick out this rotten Herod and bring back God. There's many different factions inside of there, which we'll talk about at a different point, but they all had a little bit different expectations. What they missed was the suffering servant, the Messiah that was going to save the people, that was going to get them forgiven from their sins. They just didn't see it. And so a lot of people didn't look at Jesus as a Messiah, primarily because they were expecting a different kind of Messiah. So in the case where we were talking about Isaiah and how a young girl or a maiden was going to have a baby and his name was going to be Emmanuel, in Hebrew, the word for young girl or maiden is the same as virgin, because back in those times, they were all the same things. Again, remember, if they weren't, they were going to get stoned to death, kicked out of their family. It was a big deal. But in Greek, which Matthew wrote in, he used the word parthenos. And parthenos means virgin, literally virgin, not young girl, not like the Hebrew at all. Parthenos was a woman who did not have sex. Think about the Parthenon, which was a temple that was attributed to Athena, who was also a virgin. So they would have understood this word not just as young girl, but absolutely as virgin. He's putting a point to it that this was not someone Joseph slept with. This was not someone that Mary slept with someone else. This is going to be a virgin birth. Absolutely. Now, he takes then, when he wakes up, Mary to be his wife. And the story of Matthew kind of blurs over many other parts of the story that we see in other Gospels. But they go to Bethlehem. They're there for the census. We don't have the nativity story we see in the other Gospels. But we do have some dates because Herod dies somewhere around 4 BC. So we know when Herod died. We know when the census was taken. So we believe that the story of Jesus being born was somewhere between 6 BC and 4 BC. We don't know, obviously, the exact dates, but we know, at least with major history milestones, the place and the time. Herod was someone who was famous, and he would have been famous even without the Bible. He's a known figure. I walked along the steps he built. I touched the arches he built. I stayed in a building I think he built. He is a known figure in history. But the other part of it is that this probably happened in summertime. If the shepherds were out in the field, which they were, if the census was being taken, it probably was during summertime. Or I've even heard after harvest time, but certainly not in the middle of winter, certainly not in December. But I think it's fine. We celebrate Christmas in December because we have to celebrate it at some point, and no one's asking us to celebrate holidays on exact dates in the Bible. So it's fine. It's fine. This lineage is showing that Jesus was born at a particular time, in a particular place, according to prophecy, and it wasn't just some random event, just sort of picked out whenever it happened. Instead, this was something that was planned from the very beginning of time. What I'm going to meditate on is the fact that God has that long view, that we find out from the very beginning of time in the Gospel of John, this was the plan to come save us. And through all these things, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Joseph, David, Solomon, the 400-year silence, even when it looked like the prophecy wasn't going to happen, we understand God still kept his eye on the ball, still looked at all the details, fulfilled all the prophecies, even when history didn't look like it was going to happen, even when there were people who were not kings and queens, not rich people, not even Jewish people. They were there being part of this plan that God had in mind from the very beginning. And what I'm going to pray about is this lack of hope we get sometimes when we don't think God is coming back for us, or he doesn't hear us, he doesn't remember us, and we give up hope. Think of how much hope everybody had knowing that Jesus was coming, the Messiah was coming, and he was coming to save us. People still have that hope. This is the rescue plan that God planned from the very beginning. And so I pray that people will always remember that he has not forgotten us. His memory is long, and he will fulfill every dot that he promised to us. And what I'm going to share with others is the fact that he is the God who keeps his promises. And the promises he made to the people all along history and the promises he made to us are all going to be fulfilled. Don't worry. All right, everyone, thanks so much. I appreciate you listening to this very first video, the Bible in Small Steps series. It's something that you can listen to as well. Like I said, there's a podcast, the Bible in Small Steps. Right now, we're in 2 Corinthians because we're a year into that podcast. We've been doing this for a whole year. We are starting this video series over with Matthew 1. So we're going to start over, and you're welcome to either listen to the podcast. You're also welcome to watch the videos here. You can always email me at jill@startwithsmallsteps.com. I would love to hear from you and hear if you're planning on joining me, you're going to read along, you're going to do this with me. Anyway, I hope that this is great for you. Please remember that you can always communicate with me, like I said, in email or in the chat with the video, whichever way you like. There's a website, thebibleinsmallsteps.com. It has a blog article for every single chapter of the Bible that we've covered already. There will be links to the podcast. You can play the podcast right there. And there will be a link to the YouTube video. Primarily because what if there are people who don't really know how to listen to a podcast or watch YouTube? They can go to this website and see it right there. But regardless of what it is, please let me know how you're doing. Are you reading along? Did you learn something today? Is there something you agreed with me today? Did I show you something new and interesting? Or do you disagree with me? It's okay. I would love to hear from you and hear how your experience is going. Have a wonderful day.